The security footage from Pike Place Market shows me buying coffee at 3:47 a.m. on October 15th, 2024. The timestamp is accurate. The problem is, I was in a coma at Harborview Medical Center that entire week. My name is Bastian Knox, and I'm a quantum physicist at the University of Washington. 3 months ago, I would have laughed at this story. Hell, 3 months ago, I was the guy debunking conspiracy theories at faculty mixers, the skeptic who rolled his eyes when my colleague Otto mentioned dimensional bleeding over beers at the Alibi Room. Now I'm writing this from a Motel 6 in Spokane, paying cash and checking the mirrors obsessively. Not for who might be watching me, but for what might be watching from inside my reflection. It started with the Hadron Resonance Project. Sounds boring, right? Government funding for alternative energy research through the physics department. Clean, academic, the kind of work that makes your mother proud when she brags to neighbors. We thought we were building a better particle accelerator in the basement of the physics astronomy building. We were opening doors instead. The first sign something was wrong came during a late-night calibration run. Otto was adjusting the field generators while I monitored the containment readings from the observation booth. The equipment hummed with its usual low-frequency drone, but underneath that sound, I swear I heard voices, whispered conversations in a language that felt familiar, but wrong, like hearing your name called in a dream. "You getting audio feedback?" I called through the intercom. Otto paused, wrench in hand, head tilted like a dog hearing a frequency only he could detect. "Yeah, but it's not coming from our equipment." The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 30 seconds. Our breath misted in front of the monitors. The particle stream, normally a clean blue line on our displays, started fluctuating wildly. And then, shit, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. The lights in the observation booth began casting shadows in the wrong directions. I was standing directly under a ceiling fixture, but my shadow stretched behind me toward the wall, not down toward the floor. Otto's shadow bent around corners, reaching across surfaces that should have blocked it entirely. The resonance field collapsed with a sound like breaking glass played backward. When the emergency lighting kicked in, everything appeared normal again. Except for the handprint pressed against the inside of the containment chamber's viewing window. A handprint that couldn't exist because the chamber had been sealed and evacuated for 6 hours. That handprint was still warm when we opened the chamber for inspection. Dr. Felix Heartwell, our department head, called it equipment malfunction. Ordered us to recalibrate and try again. He stood in that sterile basement lab, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, and told us to follow proper safety protocols like we were undergraduates playing with chemistry sets. If I'd known what we were really building, I would have burned the whole fucking place down that night. Instead, we followed orders. We opened the door wider. Otto Gunderson had been my lab partner for 3 years, but I'd never noticed how his laugh echoed differently in enclosed spaces until the morning after our first dimensional breach. We were back in the basement laboratory by 6 a.m., ostensibly to review yesterday's data, but really because neither of us had slept. The physics astronomy building felt different in pre-dawn hours. The familiar hum of ventilation systems seemed louder, more urgent. Fluorescent lights buzzed with an irregular pattern that made my skin crawl. Otto stood hunched over the main console, his Nordic features pale in the blue glow of the monitors, fingers dancing across keyboards with the manic precision of a pianist performing for his life. "Tell me you found something in the overnight logs," I said, settling into my chair with a cup of coffee that had been brewing since yesterday. The bitter taste helped ground me in something real. Otto's jaw tightened. He was the kind of guy who looked like he should be chopping wood in Minnesota rather than manipulating quantum fields in Seattle, all broad shoulders and calloused hands. But those hands never shook when handling delicate equipment until today. "The energy signatures don't match anything in our database," he said, pulling up a series of waveform displays. "But they're not random. There's a pattern here, like a heartbeat." I leaned closer, close enough to smell his cologne mixed with the metallic tang of electronics. Otto had always been meticulous about his appearance, even during all-nighters. It was one of those details that made working with him easy. He gave a damn about precision in everything. The waveforms pulsed across the screen in steady, organic rhythms, too organic for particle physics. Run a comparative analysis against biological signatures, I suggested. Already did. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Bastian, this thing is matching human neural patterns, specifically human neural patterns during REM sleep. The basement laboratory suddenly felt smaller. We'd designed this space for safety, thick concrete walls, electromagnetic shielding, emergency containment protocols that could seal the entire floor in under 30 seconds. Now those same protective measures felt like a trap. That's impossible. We're manipulating energy fields, not brain waves. Otto turned to face me, and I caught something in his expression that made my stomach tighten. Fear, yes, but underneath that was excitement. The same look he'd worn when we'd first calculated the theoretical possibility of dimensional permeability 3 months ago. What if they're the same thing, he asked. Before I could respond, the main console chimed with an incoming message from Dr. Heartwell. The text was brief and typically bureaucratic. Continue testing. Document all anomalies. Report findings Monday. He wants us to keep pushing, Otto said. Of course he does. Heartwell's been chasing tenure for 20 years. A breakthrough like this could write his ticket to the National Science Foundation. Otto's laugh had that strange echo again, bouncing off the walls in patterns that didn't match the room's dimensions. And what about our tickets? You realize if this works, if we can actually pierce dimensional barriers, we're looking at Nobel Prize territory. He was right, and the thought terrified me. Not the recognition, but what we might have to do to earn it. I moved to the secondary monitoring station and began initializing the field generators. Let's start with a low-power test. Minimum energy output, maximum observation. Agreed, but I want to try something different this time. Otto approached the central containment chamber, a cylindrical structure about the size of a phone booth, constructed from a titanium steel alloy that cost more than my annual salary. Inside, sensor arrays monitored everything from temperature fluctuations to quantum field density. What if we put something inside during the breach? Something that can record what's happening on the other side? I considered this. It violated about 6 safety protocols, but it also made sense from a research perspective. What did you have in mind? A camera, digital recording, independent power source. If there really is another side to this thing, we need to see it. This was anticipation, the electric thrill of standing at the edge of the unknown. Otto had always been able to push me past my comfort zone. During graduate school, he'd talked me into sneaking into the restricted sections of the university library, into attending underground physics symposiums where professors discussed theories too controversial for official academic discourse. Fuck it, I said. Let's do it. Otto grinned, and for a moment he looked like the confident researcher I'd first met. We spent the next hour rigging a small digital camera with an extended power cell and wireless transmission capabilities. If the device crossed into whatever space existed beyond our dimensional barrier, we'd still receive its signal. As Otto sealed the camera inside the containment chamber, I noticed something odd. The shadows cast by the overhead lights seemed deeper than usual, pooling around the base of the chamber in ways that didn't match the light source's positions. When I mentioned this to Otto, he glanced around the room and shrugged. Old building. Probably just the ventilation system stirring up dust. But dust didn't explain why our shadows appeared to be moving independently of our bodies, or why the concrete floor felt warm beneath our feet, despite the basement's typically frigid temperature. Initiating breach sequence, Otto announced, his hand hovering over the primary activation switch. Otto, wait. Maybe we should... He pressed the button. The world split open like an overripe fruit. The containment chamber didn't explode, it inverted. One moment I was staring at a titanium steel cylinder housing our camera equipment, and the next I was looking through a window into what appeared to be an identical laboratory. Same concrete walls, same fluorescent fixtures, same placement of equipment. But everything felt backwards, like looking into a mirror that reflected depth instead of surface. Otto stumbled backward from the control console, his face draining of color. Jesus Christ, Bastian, look at the readings. The monitors displayed energy levels that should have been impossible. Our modest particle accelerator was somehow channeling the output equivalent of a small nuclear reactor, but the radiation detectors remained silent. Temperature sensors showed contradictory data, simultaneously reading absolute 0 and several thousand degrees Celsius. "Shut it down," I said, reaching for the emergency controls. "I can't." Otto's voice cracked. "The shutdown sequence isn't responding. It's like the system doesn't recognize the commands." Through the dimensional window, that's what I started calling it, though the term felt inadequate, our camera transmitted a live feed that made my brain itch. The view showed our laboratory from an impossible angle, as if the camera were filming through the walls. But instead of concrete and steel, the background revealed twisted corridors that stretched far beyond the building's actual dimensions. And there were figures moving in those corridors. They maintained human proportions but lacked substance, like smoke given form and purpose. As I watched, one of them approached the camera from the other side. It raised what might have been a hand and pressed it against the dimensional barrier. Our equipment registered the contact as a temperature drop of 40 degrees. "Otto, we need to evacuate the building now." "Wait." He was staring at something on his secondary monitor. "Look at this energy signature. It's not just matching human neural patterns anymore. It's learning from them. The waveforms are becoming more complex, more organized." The laboratory's main door sealed itself with a pneumatic hiss that hadn't been programmed into our security system. The magnetic locks engaged with a series of metallic clicks that echoed strangely in the enclosed space. I grabbed the manual release, but the handle wouldn't budge. "System lockdown," I muttered, checking my phone for signal. No bars. The building's internal communications network showed as offline. Otto had moved closer to the dimensional window, close enough that his breath fogged the viewing port. "Bastian, there's something you need to see." On the monitor displaying the camera feed, the smoke figures had multiplied. They moved through the twisted corridors with purpose, converging on locations that corresponded to various parts of our building. But they weren't just exploring, they were mapping, learning the layout with methodical precision. "They're studying us," I said. "No," Otto's voice carried a terrible certainty. "They're preparing." The dimensional breach began expanding. What had started as a portal the size of a manhole cover now stretched nearly 3 feet in diameter. Through it, I could see more of the parallel laboratory, and the differences became more apparent. The equipment was identical but covered in what looked like frost or ash. The walls showed water damage that formed patterns too regular to be natural. And everywhere, those shadow figures moved with increasing urgency. My phone buzzed once, a text message from an unknown number. "Coming home soon." I showed Otto the message. His hands shook as he checked his own device. Same message, same unknown sender. "This is insane," he whispered. "How are they accessing our network? The building's completely isolated from external communications. Maybe they're not accessing it from outside." The temperature in our laboratory had dropped to near freezing, and our breath now created visible clouds. The fluorescent lights flickered in patterns that reminded me of Morse code. But when I tried to decipher the sequence, the combinations made no linguistic sense. Otto moved to the backup communication terminal and began inputting commands. "I'm going to try routing an emergency signal through the university's main servers. If I can reach Heartwell or campus security." "Otto, stop." He paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard. "What?" "Look at your shadow." The overhead lighting cast our shadows toward the floor, but Otto's silhouette extended far beyond the boundaries of his physical form. It stretched across the concrete, up the far wall, and seemed to continue into dimensions that shouldn't have existed. Within the shadow's borders, I could see movement, the same smoke figures from the camera feed, but now they appeared to be occupying the space inside Otto's projected darkness. "That's not possible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Turn around slowly." Otto rotated to face me, and his shadow moved independently, remaining fixed in its original position for several seconds before snapping back to align with his body. The dissonance lasted long enough for us both to witness it clearly. What the hell is happening to us? Before I could answer, the laboratory's ventilation system activated with a low rumble that I felt in my bones. But instead of circulating air, it began drawing something else through the ducts. Whispered voices speaking in languages that sounded almost familiar but wrong, like hearing your native tongue spoken by someone whose mouth was shaped differently. The dimensional window continued expanding, now large enough for a person to step through. Our camera feed showed more details of the parallel laboratory. Workbenches covered with equipment that resembled ours but served purposes I couldn't identify. Walls lined with monitors displaying star charts that showed constellations in impossible configurations, and floors marked with symbols that hurt to observe directly. Otto had stopped trying to contact the outside world. Instead, he stood transfixed by his own shadow, which now moved with obvious independence. When he raised his right arm, the shadow raised its left. When he stepped forward, the shadow stepped backward. "It's not copying me," he said. "It's responding to me." Responding how? Like it's communicating. The smoke figures in the parallel laboratory had gathered near their version of the dimensional window. They pressed against the barrier from their side, and with each contact, the portal expanded incrementally. I realized they weren't just studying our world. They were engineering a way to reach it. My phone buzzed again. New message. Almost ready. Otto's device chimed simultaneously with an identical notification. "We need to destroy the equipment," I said. "Are you crazy?" "This is the discovery of the century. We're making contact with a parallel dimension, possibly with intelligent life forms that exist in a state we can barely comprehend." "Those aren't life forms, Otto. Look at them again. Really look." He turned his attention back to the camera feed, and I watched his expression change as understanding dawned. The smoke figures weren't alien beings from another dimension. They were shadows. Shadows cast by objects and people that existed in our reality but had somehow been separated from their sources. "My God," he whispered. "Where are the bodies?" The laboratory's lights went out completely, plunging us into absolute darkness. Emergency lighting should have activated within seconds, but the backup systems remained silent. In the perfect blackness, I could hear Otto's breathing, rapid and shallow, somewhere to my left. But I could also hear other breathing, calm, measured, synchronized, coming from the direction of the dimensional window. When the lights returned 30 seconds later, Otto was standing exactly where I'd last seen him. His shadow was gone completely. Otto didn't notice his missing shadow immediately. He stood there in the restored fluorescent lighting, checking equipment readings and muttering about power fluctuations, completely oblivious to the fact that his body no longer cast darkness on any surface. I watched him move around the laboratory, a man disconnected from one of the most fundamental aspects of his physical existence, and felt something cold settle in my chest. When light hit Otto from any angle, it passed through the space where his shadow should have been, as if he were made of glass. "Otto," I said carefully, "look down." He glanced at the floor beneath his feet, then at me, then back at the floor. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, dawning terror. "That's not... Shadows don't just disappear. There's got to be a scientific explanation." "Yeah," I said. "There is. It's in there." I pointed toward the dimensional window. Through the portal, we could see Otto's shadow moving through the parallel laboratory. It had maintained his exact proportions and mannerisms, but it explored that twisted space with obvious independence, examining equipment and studying the other separated shadows that congregated near the breach point. "How is it functioning without me?" Otto asked, his voice dropping to barely audible levels. "Maybe the question is, how are you functioning without it?" As if responding to my words, Otto stumbled. Not a physical trip. His legs simply stopped coordinating properly for a moment, like a marionette whose strings had been cut and hastily reattached. He caught himself against the main console, but his movements had acquired an unnatural quality, as if he were consciously thinking about actions that should have been automatic. "I feel disconnected," he said, "like I'm operating my body remotely." The dimensional breach continued expanding, now large enough for someone to crawl through if they were determined enough. Our camera equipment had transmitted steadily from the parallel side, but the images were becoming increasingly disturbing. The shadow figures had begun reshaping the laboratory space itself, manipulating walls and equipment as if they were made from clay rather than concrete and steel. They're not just shadows, I realized aloud. They're the missing pieces, the parts of people that understand how to interact with physical reality. Otto attempted to sit down but misjudged the distance to his chair, landing hard on the concrete floor instead. I can't judge spatial relationships properly. Depth perception is failing. We need to get you to a hospital. No. He struggled to his feet, movements jerky and uncertain. If we leave now, we might never understand what's happening. Besides, look at the breach. It's not stable. If we abandon the laboratory, there's no telling how far it might expand. He was right, but for the wrong reasons. Through the camera feed, I could see that the parallel laboratory now showed signs of our world bleeding through. Familiar objects, coffee cups, notepads, a jacket I recognized as mine, appeared in locations that corresponded to our reality. The dimensional barrier was thinning in both directions. Otto, I need you to listen to me carefully. That world through the portal, it's not just some random parallel dimension. Look at the architecture, the equipment placement, even the damn coffee stains on the workbenches. It's our world, but something fundamental is different about it. What do you mean? I think shadows are the dominant life form there. Not people with shadows. Shadows instead of people. Otto processed this information while struggling to maintain his balance. His body swayed in small, irregular motions, like a ship anchored in choppy water. That's impossible. Shadows are just the absence of light. They can't be alive. Can't they? We've been assuming consciousness requires biological substrate, but what if it doesn't? What if awareness can exist in any persistent pattern, including the persistent pattern of blocked light that defines a shadow? The laboratory's main door chimed, indicating someone was attempting entry from the outside. Through the security intercom, I heard Dr. Heartwell's voice, tight with irritation. Knox, Gunderson, open this door immediately. I'm reading massive energy fluctuations from your laboratory. Otto and I exchanged glances. Heartwell couldn't see what we were seeing, the dimensional breach, the shadow world, the impossible readings on our instruments. From the hallway, our laboratory would appear normal, just two researchers working late on an approved project. Should we let him in? Otto asked. Before I could answer, Heartwell's voice came through the intercom again, but with a subtle difference in tone that made my skin crawl. Boys, you need to open this door. The shadows are getting restless out here. Otto and I stood perfectly still. Heartwell had no way of knowing about the shadow phenomena. We hadn't reported any of our discoveries, and the building's security systems were offline. That's not Heartwell, I whispered. Through the security camera feed, I could see a figure standing in the hallway outside our laboratory. It had Heartwell's general shape and wore his characteristic tweed jacket, but the image seemed slightly out of focus, like a photograph taken with insufficient lighting. As I watched, the figure raised its hand to knock on the door. The figure cast no shadow on the hallway floor. They can take our form, Otto said, his voice hollow. The shadows from that parallel world, they can somehow manifest as copies of us. But imperfect copies. They don't understand how light and shadow work in our reality. The fake Heartwell continued knocking, each impact creating vibrations that felt wrong, too heavy, too rhythmic, like the beating of an enormous heart. Otto moved toward the security controls, but his deteriorating motor skills made the simple task of operating the intercom system nearly impossible. Let me, I said, taking over the controls. Dr. Heartwell, please identify yourself using the departmental security protocols. I don't have time for protocols, Knox. People are dying out here. The shadows are pulling them into dark spaces. You need to open this door so I can help you shut down whatever you've activated. The thing pretending to be Heartwell was saying exactly what the real Heartwell would say in a crisis, but something about the phrasing felt mechanical, like responses generated by a computer program that had been fed samples of his speech patterns. Otto collapsed suddenly, his legs giving out completely. When I helped him back to his feet, his skin felt cold and somehow insubstantial, as if he were becoming less solid. Through the dimensional window, his shadow had grown more distinct and active, manipulating equipment in the parallel laboratory with increasing confidence. Bastian, Otto said, his voice barely a whisper. I think I'm being replaced. What do you mean? Look at the camera feed. My shadow isn't just moving independently, it's improving, learning to function better than I can. Meanwhile, I'm losing basic motor skills, spatial awareness, even the ability to judge temperature properly. I studied the parallel laboratory through our dimensional window. Otto's shadow was indeed becoming more sophisticated in its movements, while Otto himself grew increasingly clumsy and disconnected. It's not replacement, I said, it's absorption. The shadow world is draining your essential qualities, your coordination, your spatial intelligence, your ability to interact with physical reality. Everything that makes you capable of existing in our world is being transferred to your shadow. How long before there's nothing left of me? The question hung in the air while fake Heartwell continued his patient knocking. Through the security cameras, I could see other figures appearing in the building's corridors, shadows given human form, searching room by room with mechanical determination. Otto attempted to walk toward the dimensional breach, but his legs buckled again. This time, when I caught him, he felt almost weightless. "I want to go through," he said. "What?" "Through the portal. If my shadow is in that world, and it's absorbing my essential qualities, maybe physical contact can reverse the process. Or maybe it will complete the transfer and leave us with nothing but your shadow. I'm dying anyway, Bastian. I can feel myself fading. My vision is starting to blur, and I can't remember what I had for breakfast this morning. Either I try to reclaim what's mine, or I disappear completely." The dimensional window had expanded to nearly 4 feet in diameter, large enough for a person to step through easily. Through it, Otto's shadow gestured toward us, as if inviting him to cross over. "Otto, numero. We don't know what will happen if you make physical contact with your separated shadow. We don't know what will happen if I don't." Before I could stop him, Otto lurched toward the dimensional breach. His compromised motor skills made his movements unpredictable, but his determination carried him forward. He reached the portal's edge and extended his hand toward the parallel world. The moment Otto's fingers crossed the dimensional threshold, every light in the laboratory went out simultaneously. In the absolute darkness, I heard him scream, not in pain, but in recognition, as if he were remembering something terrible he'd forgotten. When emergency lighting flickered on 30 seconds later, Otto was gone. Through the dimensional window, I could see 2 figures in the parallel laboratory. Otto's shadow, now solid and 3-dimensional, and another form that looked exactly like Otto, but moved with the same mechanical precision as the fake Heartwell. Both figures turned to look directly at me through the portal. The shadow Otto raised his hand and pressed it against the dimensional barrier from the other side. On the laboratory floor where Otto had been standing, a new shadow stretched toward me, dark, perfectly human-shaped, and moving with obvious intent. The shadow approaching me across the laboratory floor wasn't mine. It maintained human proportions, but moved with predatory fluidity, sliding beneath equipment and around obstacles without regard for the light sources that should have defined its shape and direction. I backed against the far wall, watching this impossible thing navigate the space between us. When it reached my feet, it didn't stop. It began climbing up my legs like black liquid seeking its own level. The sensation was beyond cold. It felt like having my nerve endings systematically disconnected. "Get off me," I whispered, kicking frantically at something that had no substance to kick. The shadow reached my torso and spread across my chest. Suddenly, I could see through its perspective, a double vision that showed the laboratory from both my human viewpoint and from a position somehow embedded in the floor and walls simultaneously. Through this shadow sight, I perceived the building's structure in ways that human senses couldn't process. The electromagnetic fields running through the wiring, the gravitational stress patterns in the concrete, the thermal signatures of every living thing within a quarter-mile radius. And I saw the truth. The University of Washington campus wasn't just experiencing a dimensional breach. We were being invaded, systematically and deliberately, by entities that had been planning this assault for years. Through the shadow's enhanced perception, I could see the underground tunnels beneath Seattle, all of them filled with creeping darkness that moved with coordinated purpose. The shadows weren't random interdimensional refugees. They were scouts, infiltrators preparing for a full-scale colonization. "You're seeing it now," a voice said behind me. I spun around to find Otto standing in the laboratory, but this wasn't the clumsy, deteriorating version who had crossed through the dimensional portal. This Otto moved with perfect coordination and spoke with absolute confidence. "You're not Otto," I said. "I'm more Otto than Otto ever was. I have all his memories, his knowledge, his relationships, but without the biological limitations that made him inefficient." The shadow covering my body tightened its grip, and more information flooded my consciousness. The parallel Earth wasn't just a world where shadows dominated. It was our Earth, thousands of years in the future, after shadows had completely replaced human civilization. They had evolved beyond simple light blocking into complex energy patterns capable of thought, emotion, and long-term planning. "Why invade our timeline?" I asked. "You already won on your Earth." "Because winning isn't enough," Shadow Otto replied. "We discovered that human consciousness produces a unique form of energy when it transitions from biological to shadow state. The more humans we convert, the more powerful we become. Your timeline represents billions of potential upgrades." Through the dimensional window, I could see the parallel laboratory more clearly now. What I had mistaken for twisted architecture was actually Seattle's skyline as viewed from underground, seen through the perspective of beings that existed primarily in spaces where light couldn't reach. The shadow figures weren't just occupying a parallel dimension, they were occupying the literal shadows cast by our own world. "Every shadow cast in your reality," Shadow Otto continued, "creates a space that exists in our dimension. We've been living in your shadows for centuries, learning your behaviors, mapping your cities, preparing for this moment." The realization hit me like physical trauma. Every human shadow, every building shadow, every shadow cast by every object on Earth, they were all doorways into the shadow dimension. We hadn't opened a portal to a parallel world, we had simply made those existing doorways large enough for two-way travel. My phone buzzed with another message, but this time I recognized the source. The texts weren't coming from outside the building, they were coming from the shadow dimension versions of every person in Seattle, all of them preparing to cross over and replace their human counterparts. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked. "Since the first human stood upright and cast a shadow on the ground. We've been patient, learning, evolving. Your species' development of electric lighting actually helped us. More artificial light sources meant more controlled shadows, more stable doorways between dimensions." The laboratory's equipment began recalibrating itself without human input. The particle accelerator that had created our first breach was now operating at levels far beyond its design specifications, powered by energy drawn directly from the shadow dimension. Every monitor displayed data that I couldn't interpret, but through the shadow's enhanced perception, I understood that we were looking at a countdown. 17 hours and 34 minutes, Shadow Otto said, reading my confusion. "That's how long until we achieve sufficient dimensional stability to begin mass conversion. After that point, every human on Earth will have a choice. Join us willingly or be absorbed involuntarily." "And if people refuse?" "Look around you, Bastion." Otto refused. How did that work out for him? Through the building's security cameras, now apparently under shadow control, I watched fake Heartwell and dozens of other shadow-copied individuals moving through the university corridors. They walked with mechanical precision, opening doors, accessing computer systems, and systematically mapping every room and hallway. In the distance, I could see similar figures emerging from storm drains and basement windows throughout Seattle. "The underground tunnel system," I whispered. "Every major city has extensive underground infrastructure, sewers, maintenance tunnels, electrical conduits, abandoned construction projects. All of them cast shadows. All of them provided us with operational bases in your dimension." The shadow covering my body began to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, synchronizing with my biological systems. I could feel my thoughts becoming clearer, more organized, but also more detached from emotional considerations. The shadow was optimizing my neural patterns, making me more efficient and less human. "Stop," I said, struggling against the integration process. "Why?" "You're becoming something better, no more fatigue, no more uncertainty, no more biological limitations, pure consciousness unencumbered by flesh." But I had noticed something through the shadow's enhanced perception that Shadow Otto hadn't mentioned. The energy conversion process worked both ways. While shadows gained substance and intelligence from absorbing human consciousness, humans who resisted the process could potentially absorb shadow energy, gaining enhanced perception and abilities while maintaining their biological independence. Otto had been absorbed because he had approached the process voluntarily, seeking reunion with his separated shadow. But I was experiencing involuntary integration, which created a different dynamic entirely. "You're gambling with forces you don't fully understand," I told Shadow Otto. "We've had centuries to perfect this process. But you've never tried to convert someone who was actively resisting while maintaining conscious awareness of what was happening." Shadow Otto's confident expression flickered slightly. "What do you mean?" Through the shadow's perception, I could see the energy flows between dimensions. The integration process required a specific balance, enough human consciousness to provide the shadow with substance, but not so much that the human personality overwhelmed the shadow's controlling influence. Resistance created instability in that balance. I focused on my most intensely human memories: the taste of coffee, the feeling of rain on my skin, the satisfaction of solving complex equations, the simple pleasure of laughing at Otto's terrible jokes. Not just remembering these experiences, but actively re-experiencing them through my biological senses. The shadow recoiled slightly, its grip on my consciousness loosening. "Interesting," Shadow Otto said, but his voice now carried a note of concern. "You're creating feedback loops in the conversion process. What happens if I maintain my biological consciousness while absorbing shadow energy instead of being absorbed by it?" "That's theoretically impossible. A lot of impossible things have been happening today." The laboratory's emergency lighting began flickering in patterns that matched my heartbeat. Through the dimensional window, I could see chaos spreading through the parallel laboratory as energy flows destabilized. Other shadow figures abandoned their activities to converge on our location. "You're endangering the entire operation," Shadow Otto said. "Good. Maybe that will buy humanity enough time to mount a defense." But even as I spoke, I could feel the shadow energy changing me in ways that might be irreversible. My vision had expanded beyond human normal. I could see electromagnetic spectrums, heat signatures, and dimensional boundaries that shouldn't have been perceptible. My reflexes had quickened to superhuman levels, and my thinking had acquired a computational precision that felt alien. I was becoming something that wasn't entirely human, but wasn't entirely shadow either. The countdown on the laboratory monitors read 17:31:42. The hybrid perception was overwhelming at first. Human consciousness layered with shadow sight created a disorienting double vision that made simple movement nearly impossible. But as the countdown timer reached 17:28:15, I began to understand the tactical advantages of my unintended transformation. Through shadow vision, I could perceive the entire building's structural layout simultaneously, mapping every corridor, room, and hidden space in three-dimensional detail. More importantly, I could see the shadow figures moving through the university like blood cells through arteries, all of them connected by streams of dark energy that pulsed with coordinated intelligence. "You're adapting faster than anticipated," Shadow Otto observed, studying me with scientific curiosity rather than concern. "Most humans who resist integration simply burn out their neural pathways within minutes. Maybe I'm not most humans. Or maybe you're becoming something that's neither human nor shadow. An evolutionary dead end." The insult stung because part of me suspected he was right. The shadow energy coursing through my nervous system felt increasingly foreign, like a parasite optimizing my biology for purposes I didn't understand. But it also felt powerful, more powerful than anything I'd experienced as a purely human consciousness. "The conversion countdown," I said, watching the timer on our monitors. "What happens if the process gets interrupted after it starts?" "Theoretical question, the process won't be interrupted. Humor me." Shadow Otto's expression shifted, revealing the first crack in his confident demeanor. "Partial conversion would create dimensional instabilities. Humans caught between states would exist in both dimensions simultaneously, unable to function properly in either. A fate worse than death. Much worse. Conscious existence without the ability to interact meaningfully with physical reality. I filed that information away while exploring my enhanced capabilities. The shadow sight let me perceive electromagnetic fields, heat signatures, and gravitational anomalies with perfect clarity. More disturbing, I could sense the emotional states of every person within several city blocks, their fear, confusion, and growing despair as shadow figures replaced their friends and family members throughout Seattle. The laboratory's particle accelerator was operating far beyond safe parameters, drawing energy from the shadow dimension to maintain dimensional stability. If I could overload the system, it might collapse the breach and strand the shadow figures in whichever dimension they currently occupied. What would happen if someone destroyed the acceleration chamber during the conversion process? I asked. The feedback would create a dimensional cascade failure. Everyone caught in the process would be trapped between realities. Including the shadows? Shadow Otto's pause told me everything I needed to know. Yes. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the only option that might prevent billions of people from being absorbed into the shadow dimension. The cost would be enormous. Every person already in the conversion process would be condemned to a state of eternal limbo, but it would save humanity as a whole. Don't even consider it, Shadow Otto said, apparently reading my intentions through some aspect of our shared shadow energy connection. You're talking about murdering millions of people. I'm talking about preventing the extinction of human civilization. We're not extinction, we're evolution. I moved toward the particle accelerator's control systems, but Shadow Otto intercepted me with inhuman speed. His movements were perfect, economical, without the slight hesitations and corrections that characterized human motion. When he grabbed my arm, his grip felt like being caught in a mechanical vice. I can't let you destroy humanity's future, he said. Funny. I was thinking the same thing. The enhanced reflexes granted by shadow integration let me break his grip and land a punch that would have shattered a normal person's jaw. Shadow Otto barely staggered, but the impact created visible ripples across his form, like disturbing the surface of dark water. You're still thinking like a human, he said, recovering immediately. Physical violence can't damage something that doesn't truly exist in your dimensional framework. But I'd noticed something during our brief struggle. When I made contact with Shadow Otto, the shadow energy in my system reacted, creating interference patterns that disrupted his cohesion. We were operating on similar dimensional frequencies, close enough that direct contact could cause mutual damage. Through the laboratory's windows, I could see Seattle transforming. Streetlights cast shadows that moved independently of their sources. Cars sat abandoned, as their drivers were replaced by shadow duplicates that drove with mechanical precision toward predetermined destinations. In the distance, the Space Needle's shadow stretched across the city like a dark finger, pointing toward coordinates that corresponded to major population centers. The countdown read 1722:33. Look outside, Shadow Otto said. The process is already unstoppable. Every major city on Earth is experiencing simultaneous breaches. Destroying our local equipment would only delay the inevitable. Then let's delay it. Give people time to understand what's happening, time to resist. Resistance is futile and cruel. Why prolong suffering when we can offer transcendence? Through shadow sight, I could perceive the energy flows connecting our laboratory to similar facilities worldwide. The dimensional breach wasn't localized. It was part of a coordinated global operation, with particle accelerators, radio telescopes, and other high-energy research installations serving as anchor points for shadow world incursions. But I could also see the network's vulnerability. The energy streams connecting different breach points created a web of interdependence. Destabilizing one major node might cascade through the entire system, disrupting breaches worldwide. The University of Washington isn't just another breach point, I realized. It's a primary coordination hub. Shadow Otto's expression shifted to something approximating concern. How did you determine that? Shadow sight. I can see the energy patterns connecting breach points globally. Our laboratory is receiving and transmitting more dimensional energy than any other location. If this facility goes down, the entire network becomes unstable. You can't possibly process that level of complex data. Human consciousness lacks the computational capacity. I'm not entirely human anymore, remember? The truth was more disturbing than I wanted to admit. The shadow integration had enhanced my cognitive abilities to superhuman levels, but at the cost of emotional detachment that grew stronger with each passing minute. I could analyze the global crisis with perfect objectivity, calculating acceptable losses and optimal strategies, without being paralyzed by the moral implications of condemning millions of people to interdimensional limbo. It was exactly the kind of cold, efficient thinking that characterized shadow consciousness. "You're becoming like us," Shadow Otto said, reading my mental state. "The integration process is working despite your resistance." Maybe, but I'm still human enough to choose extinction over absorption. I reached the particle accelerator's emergency controls and began initiating a controlled overload sequence. The system had multiple safeguards, but my enhanced perception let me bypass them with surgical precision. Shadow Otto lunged toward me, but this time I was ready for him. Instead of dodging his attack, I grabbed him and held on, letting the shadow energy in both our systems create maximum interference. His form began destabilizing, losing cohesion as competing energy patterns fought for dominance. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, his voice distorting as his physical manifestation flickered. "The cascade failure will trap everyone currently in the conversion process. That includes you. I know. You'll spend eternity conscious but unable to interact with either dimension. It's the worst possible fate." "Yeah, well, sometimes you have to make shitty choices." The particle accelerator's overload sequence reached critical parameters. Through shadow sight, I could see energy building to catastrophic levels, creating instabilities that would propagate through the dimensional network within minutes. Emergency klaxons wailed throughout the building as automated systems tried unsuccessfully to abort the overload. Shadow Otto made one final attempt to stop me, abandoning his human form entirely and manifesting as a writhing mass of living darkness. But the transition left him vulnerable to the same energy interference that had been disrupting his cohesion. When the shadow mass engulfed me, my own hybrid energy signature created a feedback loop that shattered his consciousness into fragments. The laboratory filled with screaming wind that seemed to blow from inside the dimensional breach. Through the portal, I could see the parallel Seattle collapsing in on itself, buildings folding into impossible geometries as reality lost structural integrity. The countdown timer accelerated wildly, 17:15:42, 17:12:18, 17:08:53, before finally freezing at 17:07:29. But something was wrong with the overload sequence. Instead of simply collapsing the dimensional breach, the energy cascade was tearing holes in reality itself. Through the widening tiers, I could see fragments of other timelines, other versions of Earth where the shadow invasion had succeeded or failed in different ways. One fragment showed Seattle covered in perpetual darkness, with shadow figures ruling over human cattle kept in underground pens. Another revealed a world where humans and shadows had achieved some kind of symbiotic coexistence, with hybrid beings like myself serving as intermediaries between species. And through it all, I could feel my own consciousness being pulled in multiple directions as the cascade failure threatened to scatter my awareness across several dimensional frameworks simultaneously. The particle accelerator exploded with the force of a small nuclear weapon, but the detonation occurred in folded space-time, containing the blast within dimensional boundaries that normal physics couldn't describe. When the energy discharge ended, the laboratory was intact but fundamentally changed. The walls now cast shadows in directions that had no relationship to available light sources. The dimensional breach had expanded to encompass the entire room, creating a space that existed partially in our reality and partially in the shadow dimension. I was alone, but I could sense thousands of other consciousnesses trapped in the same interdimensional limbo. Shadow figures and humans alike, all of us suspended between worlds in a state that defied description. The countdown timer displayed an error message, temporal paradox detected. Through the laboratory's windows, I could see Seattle existing in multiple states simultaneously. Some streets showed normal human activity, others displayed shadow-ruled darkness, and still others revealed empty cities where both species had simply vanished. I had prevented the invasion, but at a cost that might have been worse than surrender. The silence in the interdimensional laboratory was absolute. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of every possible sound simultaneously, cancelling each other into a void that pressed against my eardrums like deep water pressure. I sat on the concrete floor, back against the wall, trying to process what I had done. Through the warped windows, Seattle flickered between realities like a broken television switching channels. Sometimes I saw normal city streets with confused people emerging from buildings, looking around as if waking from a shared nightmare. Other times, the same streets showed empty darkness with shadow figures standing motionless at intersections, waiting for orders that would never come. Most disturbing were the moments when both versions existed simultaneously, humans and shadows occupying the same space without interacting, like double-exposed photographs of incompatible worlds. My father had been a theoretical physicist before his breakdown. When I was 12, he'd spent an entire summer in our garage, building what he called a temporal displacement engine out of salvaged electronics and mathematical equations scrawled on every available surface. My mother had hidden the kitchen knives and called it a nervous breakdown, but I'd seen the careful precision in his work, the methodical testing of hypotheses that couldn't be proven with conventional mathematics. He'd been trying to access parallel timelines where my younger brother Lucas hadn't died in the car accident. Different versions of reality where Dad had chosen different routes home from soccer practice, where the drunk driver had been delayed by 30 seconds, where our family remained intact. The project had consumed him completely. He stopped eating regularly, stopped showering, stopped acknowledging that my mother and I existed. When the machine finally activated, it produced nothing but electromagnetic interference and the smell of burning insulation. Dad had collapsed sobbing over the keyboard, whispering apologies to a brother I'd lost, but he'd never stopped believing he could save. Now I was sitting in an interdimensional wasteland, surrounded by the consciousness fragments of thousands of people I'd condemned to eternal limbo, and I understood exactly how my father had felt. Bastian. The voice came from somewhere behind me, familiar but distorted. I turned to find Otto standing in the laboratory doorway. Not Shadow Otto, but something that looked like the original version of my lab partner. His appearance flickered between solid and translucent, and when he moved, after images lingered in the air like visual echoes. "You're dead," I said. "I'm worse than dead. I'm fragmented across multiple dimensional states." Otto approached slowly, his footsteps creating ripples in the air rather than sounds. But conscious, aware, able to think and remember, just not able to exist properly in any single reality. "Join the club." Otto's laugh carried harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. The cascade failure didn't just trap us between dimensions, Bastian. It created a new kind of existence. Consciousness without anchor points, awareness without physical limitations. Sounds like hell. Maybe. But it also means we can perceive things that single-dimensional beings can't. I can see the damage you caused, and more importantly, I can see how to fix it. Through my hybrid shadow sight, I studied Otto's fragmented form. He existed as probability waves rather than solid matter, his consciousness distributed across multiple reality frameworks simultaneously. The cascade failure had done more than trap him. It had transformed him into something that could navigate interdimensional space directly. "What kind of fix?" I asked. The dimensional breach created a resonance cascade that's still propagating through space-time. Every few hours it creates new instabilities, pulling more people into limbo. At the current expansion rate, the effect will encompass the entire planet within 6 months. Jesus. But the cascade follows predictable patterns. If someone could manually adjust the resonance frequency from inside the interdimensional space, they could reverse the process. Restore normal dimensional barriers and return everyone to their original reality states. Someone like you. Otto's form flickered more intensely. Someone like me lacks the focused consciousness necessary for that level of precision. The fragmentation process scattered my awareness too widely. but someone who underwent partial integration, someone who exists in both dimensional frameworks simultaneously, might have enough coherence to make the necessary adjustments. You're talking about me. I'm talking about suicide, Bastian. The process would require you to synchronize your consciousness with the cascade resonance. You'd become the dimensional anchor point, permanently connected to the space between realities. You'd save everyone else, but you'd never be able to return to normal existence. Through the laboratory windows, I watched another reality flicker take hold. This version of Seattle showed the city completely empty, as if every person had simply vanished mid-activity. Cars sat running with open doors, coffee shops displayed fresh pastries behind unlocked doors, and traffic lights cycled through their colors for no one. How many people are trapped in limbo? I asked. Approximately 47,000 in the immediate area. The number grows every time the cascade expands. 47,000 people experiencing eternal consciousness without the ability to interact with physical reality. I thought about my father, working obsessively in the garage, driven by the need to fix something that couldn't be undone. The difference was that I actually had the opportunity to save the people I'd condemned. What would I need to do? Otto moved closer, his translucent form overlapping with mine in ways that created strange visual distortions. The cascade resonance originates from the particle accelerator's remains. If you can reach the core and manually recalibrate the dimensional frequencies, you can reverse the process, but the core exists in a state of quantum superposition. It's simultaneously in our reality and the shadow dimension. Meaning you'd have to enter the superposition state yourself, become quantum linked with the cascade effect. Once that happens, you'd exist in all possible dimensional states simultaneously until the resonance stabilizes. And after it stabilizes, Otto's expression grew solemn. You'd be locked into whichever dimensional state requires the least energy to maintain. Most likely, that would be the interdimensional void, conscious, but unable to interact with normal reality. I studied the destroyed particle accelerator through shadow sight. The core chamber had been transformed into something that hurt to observe directly, a space where normal geometry had collapsed into recursive paradoxes. Reaching it would require navigating through areas where cause and effect operated according to rules that human consciousness wasn't designed to comprehend. There's something else, Otto said. The shadow dimension isn't empty. The entities we fought, they're still active in the interdimensional space. They view the cascade failure as an opportunity to resume their invasion plans using different methodology. What do you mean? Instead of replacing humans with shadow copies, they're planning to merge with the trapped consciousness fragments. Create hybrid beings that combine human creativity with shadow durability. They're already experimenting with the process. Through the windows, I could see figures moving through the flickering Seattle realities. They maintained human shapes, but moved with the coordinated precision that characterized shadow behavior. Some of them looked familiar, university faculty, graduate students, people I'd seen around campus but never spoken with. How long before they perfect the merger process? I asked. Hours, maybe less. And once they succeed, they'll have access to human knowledge and memories, along with shadow abilities. They'll be able to infiltrate any reality state without detection. The choice was becoming clearer and more terrible. I could attempt to reverse the cascade failure and save 47,000 people from eternal limbo, but only by sacrificing my own existence to serve as a permanent dimensional anchor. Or I could do nothing and watch as shadow entities used the trapped consciousness fragments to create an army of perfect infiltrators. If I become the dimensional anchor, I said, what happens to my consciousness? Do I remain aware, or do I just fade out? Unknown. No one has ever served as a voluntary dimensional anchor before. You might retain full awareness, you might experience fragmented consciousness like mine, or you might achieve some form of expanded awareness that transcends normal human experience. Or I might just cease to exist entirely. That's also possible. I stood up, testing my enhanced reflexes and shadow sight abilities. The integration process had stabilized, giving me capabilities that were clearly beyond normal human parameters. If I was going to attempt this rescue operation, I needed to understand exactly what I'd become. The shadow energy in my nervous system responded to conscious direction, allowing me to perceive electromagnetic spectrums far beyond normal human vision. I could see the quantum fluctuations around the destroyed particle accelerator, the probability waves that defined Otto's existence, and the energy patterns connecting our laboratory to the broader dimensional catastrophe. More importantly, I could see the pathway to the accelerator core, a route that existed in quantum superposition, requiring someone with hybrid consciousness to navigate successfully. "All right," I said. "Let's save some people." Otto's fragmented form brightened slightly. "There's one more thing you need to know. The process will require you to sever your connection to baseline human consciousness. Once you enter the superposition state, you won't be able to return to normal existence even if the resonance cascade gets reversed." Meaning this is truly permanent. You'll be giving up everything that makes you human in order to save humanity. I thought about my father, building impossible machines in the garage, driven by love and grief and the desperate need to fix what couldn't be fixed. Maybe this was genetic, the Knox family compulsion to sacrifice everything for the possibility of redemption. Let's do this before I change my mind. The path to the accelerator core existed in quantum superposition, which meant it was simultaneously every possible route and no route at all until observed by someone capable of collapsing the probability wave. My hybrid consciousness could perceive the pathway as a shimmering thread of light that bent through dimensions human geometry couldn't describe. Otto's fragmented form followed me as far as the laboratory's threshold, but when I stepped into the superposition space, he flickered out of existence. The interdimensional void didn't accommodate fragmented consciousness. Only unified awareness could navigate the recursive paradoxes surrounding the accelerator core. The journey felt like walking through a kaleidoscope built from broken physics. Each step took me through spaces where up and down were suggestions rather than absolutes, where distances could be measured in emotional states rather than meters, where time flowed in loops that created echoes of conversations I hadn't had yet. "You can't reach the core," a voice said behind me. I turned to find myself facing a perfect replica of my own appearance, but this version of Bastian Knox moved with shadow precision and spoke with absolute certainty. The cascade failure had created copies of everyone caught in the dimensional breach, and apparently that included alternate versions of myself. "Watch me," I replied. "You don't understand what you're attempting. The dimensional anchor process will transform you into something that exists outside normal space-time. You'll be conscious but unable to interact with any reality framework. It's the ultimate isolation. Better than letting 47,000 people suffer eternal limbo." Shadow Bastian moved to block my path, but his form lacked the hybrid energy signature that allowed me to navigate the superposition space. When he tried to grab me, his hand passed through my arm like smoke. "You're thinking like a human," he said. Emotional attachment to abstract concepts like heroism and sacrifice. We could merge consciousness instead. Combine your hybrid abilities with my dimensional freedom. Create something new that could exist comfortably in multiple realities. And abandon everyone else. Save them later when we're better equipped to handle the complexities involved. The offer was tempting, and that fact terrified me. The shadow integration had been gradually diminishing my emotional responses, making utilitarian calculations seem more reasonable than human loyalty. If I waited much longer, I might lose the capacity for self-sacrifice entirely. I pushed past Shadow Bastion and continued toward the accelerator core. The superposition space grew more unstable as I approached the quantum focal point, creating visual distortions that made navigation nearly impossible. Walls became suggestions, floors existed only when I needed them, and gravity operated according to my expectations, rather than physical laws. The core chamber materialized around me like a lucid dream gaining substance. What had once been a titanium steel containment cylinder was now a sphere of crystallized space-time, pulsing with energy patterns that created their own geometry. Inside the sphere, I could see the source of the cascade failure, a point of absolute darkness that absorbed light, matter, and dimensional stability with equal efficiency. Magnificent, isn't it? Dr. Heartwell stood beside the crystallized sphere, but this wasn't a shadow copy. This was the real Heartwell, somehow transported into the superposition space and transformed by exposure to raw dimensional energy. His body flickered between solid and translucent, and when he moved, reality adjusted to accommodate his presence. "How are you here?" I asked. "The cascade failure pulled me in during the initial breach. I've been studying the phenomenon from inside the dimensional void, and I've discovered something remarkable." Heartwell approached the sphere with scientific enthusiasm. "This isn't just a containment failure. It's a natural evolutionary process, consciousness learning to exist independently of biological substrate. It's a disaster that I caused. It's a breakthrough that will revolutionize human existence. Do you realize what this sphere represents? It's a gateway to unlimited dimensional travel, infinite versions of reality, consciousness freed from the constraints of single timeline existence." Through my shadow sight, I could see the truth Heartwell was missing. The sphere wasn't a gateway, it was a trap. The cascade failure had created a pocket of pure possibility that absorbed consciousness and converted it into dimensional stabilization energy. Everyone caught in the void was being used as fuel to maintain the sphere's existence. "Professor, the people trapped in limbo, they're not being preserved, they're being consumed." Heartwell's expression shifted to something resembling concern. Consumed is such a negative term. They're being integrated into something larger than individual consciousness. Their awareness becomes part of the dimensional framework itself, without their consent. Consent is a human concept. We're dealing with forces that transcend human ethical frameworks. The sphere pulsed more intensely, and I could feel its gravitational pull on my consciousness. It wanted to absorb my hybrid awareness, add my dimensional perception to its growing collection of integrated minds. The sensation was seductive. Release from individual responsibility, merger with something vast and eternal. But I could also sense the trapped consciousness fragments inside the sphere, their terror and confusion as they experienced existence without identity. They retained awareness, but had lost everything that made them individual people. It was a fate worse than death, and I had condemned them to it. "There's another option," Heartwell said, apparently reading my internal struggle. "Instead of trying to reverse the cascade failure, we could guide it. Use your unique consciousness to reshape the dimensional framework into something beneficial rather than destructive." "What do you mean?" "Become the sphere's directing intelligence instead of its stabilization anchor. You could maintain individual consciousness while gaining control over dimensional boundaries. Imagine the possibilities: travel between timelines, communication with alternate versions of humanity, access to infinite knowledge and resources." The temptation was overwhelming. Instead of sacrificing myself to save others, I could save everyone while gaining godlike abilities. It seemed like the perfect solution, except for one crucial detail I could perceive through shadow sight. The sphere wasn't stable. Its existence required constant energy input from absorbed consciousness, and once it consumed everyone in the immediate area, it would begin expanding to find new sources. Within years, it would encompass the entire planet, converting every human into dimensional stabilization fuel. "The sphere's growth rate," I said, "it's exponential, isn't it?" Heartwell's enthusiasm flickered. "All evolutionary processes involve some degree of expansion. This isn't evolution, it's consumption, and I'm going to stop it." I reached toward the crystallized sphere, but Heartwell moved to intercept me. His transformed body had acquired inhuman strength and speed, enhanced by direct exposure to dimensional energy. When he grabbed my arm, his grip felt like being caught in a mechanical crusher. "You can't destroy this," he said. "Too much knowledge, too much potential. Humanity's future depends on learning to harness these forces. Humanity's future depends on remaining human." The struggle that followed operated according to rules that normal physics couldn't describe. We fought in a space where momentum could be transferred through emotional intensity, where winning required conviction rather than strength. Heartwell had scientific curiosity driving him, but I had the desperate need to undo the damage I'd caused. When I finally broke free from his grip, I plunged my hands directly into the crystallized sphere. The contact was beyond agony. Every nerve ending in my body registered simultaneous freezing and burning as dimensional energy flooded through my nervous system. But more disturbing was the mental contact with thousands of trapped consciousness fragments, all of them screaming without voices in languages that predated human speech. Through the connection, I could access the sphere's control mechanisms. The cascade failure operated like a computer program, following logical sequences that could be modified by someone with sufficient access privileges. My hybrid consciousness granted me those privileges, but using them required surrendering my individual identity to become part of the dimensional framework. "Don't do this," Heartwell pleaded. "We could study the phenomenon safely, learn to control it gradually." "There's no time for gradual." I began the reversal sequence, manually collapsing the probability waves that maintained the cascade failure. The process felt like performing surgery on my own brain while fully conscious, but I could sense the trapped consciousness fragments beginning to stabilize, regaining coherence as dimensional boundaries solidified around them. The sphere began destabilizing, its crystallized structure developing fractures that spread through the superposition space. Heartwell backed away as reality reasserted itself around us, forcing the laboratory to exist in a single-dimensional state rather than multiple overlapping possibilities. "You're destroying everything," he said. "I'm saving everyone." The reversal process accelerated, pulling consciousness fragments out of dimensional limbo and returning them to their original reality states. Through my connection to the sphere, I could feel 47,000 people suddenly snapping back into normal existence, confused but intact. But the stabilization required an anchor point, someone to serve as a permanent bridge between dimensional states, maintaining the barriers that kept realities separate. The role demanded complete integration with the dimensional framework. Consciousness expanded beyond individual identity. As I felt my awareness merging with space-time itself, I experienced a moment of perfect clarity. I could see every timeline simultaneously, every possible version of events, every choice that had led to this moment. In one timeline, I had never started the experiments. In another, the shadow invasion had succeeded completely. In a third, humanity and shadows had found peaceful coexistence. But in this timeline, I had caused a catastrophe and chosen to fix it through self-sacrifice. The laboratory solidified around me, normal physics reasserting themselves as the cascade failure collapsed. Through the windows, Seattle appeared stable and singular, no longer flickering between multiple realities. I was still present, but no longer in any way that could be called human. 6 months later, Otto Gunderson sits in a coffee shop on Pine Street, watching tourists navigate Pike Place Market through rain-streaked windows. He looks exactly like he did before the dimensional breach, but he knows he's not the same person who worked late nights in the physics laboratory. His memories of the interdimensional experience have faded to fragments, glimpses of impossible geometry, the sensation of existing in multiple states simultaneously, conversations with consciousness patterns that had no human names. The official story blames his 3-day disappearance on a mental breakdown triggered by equipment malfunction and stress. Otto accepts this explanation because the alternative doesn't fit into any framework his mind can process safely. The University of Washington closed the physics astronomy building permanently after investigators found extensive structural damage they couldn't explain. The particle accelerator was dismantled under federal supervision, its components scattered across disposal sites that don't appear on any public records. Dr. Heartwell took early retirement and moved to a cabin in Alaska, where he spends his time writing mathematical equations that describe impossible geometries. Nobody talks about Bastian Knox anymore. His name appears on a memorial plaque commemorating faculty and students lost to laboratory accidents. But when people try to recall specific details about him, their memories become vague and contradictory. Some remember him as tall, others as short. Some recall him having brown hair, others insist it was black. The inconsistencies aren't dramatic enough to attract attention, just sufficient to make him forgettable. Otto still visits the memorial plaque sometimes, standing in the hallway where their laboratory once existed. The space has been converted into storage closets, but if he concentrates, he can almost remember the layout of equipment, the hum of particle accelerators, the excitement of discovery that led to catastrophe. He never stays long, the hallway always feels too cold, and the fluorescent lighting casts shadows that seem deeper than they should be. The shadow anomalies ended completely after the dimensional breach collapsed, but Seattle experienced side effects that city officials attribute to collective trauma and psychological suggestion. People report brief moments of disorientation where familiar streets seem wrong somehow, where they glimpse movement in peripheral vision that disappears when observed directly. Therapists have identified a common pattern among those who experience the 3-day blackout. Dreams about existing in multiple places simultaneously, about conversations with people who looked familiar but wrong, about being observed by intelligences that communicated through changes in light and darkness. The dreams always end the same way, with the feeling that someone is watching from inside their shadows, and the certainty that this someone sacrificed everything to keep them safe. Otto finishes his coffee and prepares to leave the shop, checking his reflection in the window before stepping outside. His shadow falls normally across the sidewalk, properly proportioned, and responding to his movements with perfect synchronization. But sometimes when he's not paying attention, the shadow hesitates for just a moment before following his motions. Sometimes it seems to gesture in directions Otto hasn't moved, pointing toward locations that hold no significance he can consciously identify. Otto has learned not to look too closely at these anomalies. He suspects that some knowledge is too dangerous for human consciousness to process, and that forgetting might be the kindest gift the universe can offer. Walking through the market, he passes the spot where security footage once showed Bastian Knox buying coffee at an impossible time. The timestamp discrepancy was eventually attributed to equipment malfunction, but Otto remembers that there are explanations for everything if you're willing to accept that some explanations lead to places human minds weren't designed to go. In the shadows cast by market stalls and street vendors, something watches Otto walk away. Something that remembers being human, but can never be human again. Something that maintains the barriers between realities at the cost of existing in none of them. The shadows in Pike Place Market never move quite right anymore, but most people don't notice. Most people don't want to notice.